The proceeding will start shortly.
Borrada, good morning. Welcome to this session of the Welsh Affairs Committee, where we're looking at the future of banking in Wales and high street banking, access to banking. It's the first of 3 evidence sessions that we're doing on this topic, and today we've got 2 panels of expert witnesses in front of us to help us with our inquiry. So for this first panel, we're joined by Carole Layzell, who's Managing Director for Barclays Local, South West and Wales, or South Wales and West, you can clarify in a moment. We're joined by Miles Ravenhill, Community Bank Director of Lloyds, also Christopher Dean, who's UK Head of Customer Channels at HSBC, and Jimmy Robertson, Head of Branch Network at NatWest. Could I ask you just to, each of you, very briefly introduce yourselves and say how many branches you currently have in Wales? So perhaps, Carole, you could go first, please.
Yeah, good morning, Borrada.
Yeah.
Carole Layzell, I'm the head of Barclays Local in the South, Wales and West.
Okay.
And currently in Wales at the moment we have 9 branches and 44 touch points where we support all of our community.
Miles?
Yep, thank you, Chair. Miles Ravenhill, I'm the Community Bank Director for Lloyds Banking Group. In Wales, we currently have 62 branches that are currently open. That will drop to 56. And then in addition to that, we've got our 16 community bankers and a further 11 due to go live.
Okay, thank you very much. And Christopher Dean, please.
Christopher Dean, UK Head of Customer Channels for HSBC. We currently have 33 branches in Wales. We have 198 pop-ups, touch points, and we're involved in the 9 banking hubs and soon to launch 3 cash pods, which I'm happy to explain further.
Okay, thank you very much. And Jimmy Robertson, please.
Good morning. Jimmy Robertson, Head of Branch Network for NatWest. We currently have 26 branches in Wales. We have got 5 mobile vans covering 82 distinct communities across Wales, and we also have our Welsh call centre in Menai, serving 50,000 calls per year.
Thank you very much. Can I ask, so you've given us quite a variance in numbers there for existing branches, and it does feel like we're in the middle of another wave of bank branch closures across Wales. So do you have in mind, each of your banks, a kind of an optimum number of branches that you want to get to, that you regard as the future steady state of high street banking in Wales? And perhaps Mr Robertson, you could go first.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, like I said, we've currently got 26 branches across Wales. We have announced all our branch closures for this year. We closed 1 earlier in Wales this year. We've got no plans to close any further branches across Wales for the remainder of this year. Any future decision around it to answer that point is going to be based on customer behaviour and how that changes over the course of time.
Okay, thank you. Mr Dean, please.
So in terms of future state, at the start of 2024, we made a branch commitment that no more branches will close in 2024, other than those that were already previously announced.
Okay, Miles Ravenhill, please.
So, as I mentioned, 62 today, that will drop to 56, which is the ones we've announced. No future number that is in mind. It will be genuinely following customer behaviour. We take any closure clearly very thoughtfully, so at this stage, that's the number.
Thank you. And Carole Layzell, please.
Yeah, we've got no more planned announced closures for this year. But again, I think it's worth stating that due to the demand reducing, we don't just look at banking needs as branches, they are actually community touch points, so there's lots of different options. And I think to your point on future strategy, I think that's what our customers are asking for us, to show up in the community in a different way.
Okay. Ms Layzell, if I can ask you, so 2 weeks ago, Barclays branch in Haverfordwest in my constituency closed. It was the last Barclays branch in the county of Pembrokeshire. I understand, and I'll defer in a moment to Ben Lake from Ceredigion, but I understand shortly there will be no more Barclays branches left in Ceredigion at all. I mean, that is a big chunk of rural West Wales where Barclays will not have a physical branch. I mean, that's a pretty big retreat from a physical presence in rural Wales, isn't it?
I think, as I mentioned before, I think for me, the way that our customers are transacting with us, if we look over the last 5 years, people using our branches has dropped by 65%. and people that are using our digital app has increased by 120%. So whilst we don't have a physical branch, we do have a physical presence. So for me, we have continued to make sure that we have local people serving our local communities, and we're showing up. You'll know that we've got the local touch point that's just opened in Haverfordwest. It could be the library, leisure centres. It's different across the 44 that we've currently got, which we're looking to grow across Wales as well. We've got 2 vans, and we've got our Welsh telephony answering service as well. So we've got our customers expecting us to show up in a different way, and of course we've got the great relationship with the post office to ensure that they've still got that access to cash.
Okay. I appreciate you highlighting those other things, and I'm sure we'll get into some more detailed questions around what alternatives and replacement services look like for customers. I was speaking recently to somebody who's has a particularly senior role in banking in the UK, and his view to me was that essentially for Wales, given the geography of the population structure, eventually there will be a model where the main high street banks have no more than 8, probably 10 branches across the whole of Wales, and that will be a future steady state. So there will be no return of branches to the high streets. This wave of branch closures that we're going through, that will continue into the future. Now, most of you have said that we've got no further plans for closure. It will be in response to consumer behaviour. But there is an expectation in the industry, isn't there, that branches progressively will disappear from more and more high streets. Is that fair? Perhaps Mr. Ravenhill, you could go first.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think, as I said earlier, customer behaviour is definitely what we're following. If I look over the last 5 years at the branches we have closed, they're 50% down in terms of transaction numbers. The branch, we are committed to having a branch network. As I said, I'm unclear on the number today because that customer behaviour needs to flow through, and we'll continue to work carefully in observing that. Clearly, we've now got the legislation that we need to follow, working with the regulator, working with Link to make sure there's good access to cash before we exit a community. And then, of course, a lot of our customers are saying actually they want more convenience, not just being able to traditionally visit a branch for advice. So when you combine that with the app, the telephony service, community bankers in particular, if there's a spot where possibly it's more rural or they may struggle to travel a further distance, I'm confident customers can talk to somebody if they want to, and they can definitely access cash if they need to.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Dean, if I could ask the same question to you, do you feel that there is a kind of an expectation actually within this industry, notwithstanding what you've said previously about no further closures for your own business in Wales, branch closures for the time being, that 2-3 years from now, a future Welsh Affairs Committee will be inviting colleagues of yours in to talk about why there are very, very few branches now remaining in large parts of Wales?
As my colleagues have said, we've seen a decline in footfall. So since Q1 2020, we've seen a decline of 55% in footfall across the branches in Wales. Since 2017, we've seen an increase of 280% in digital usage. And 9 out of 10 customers now will do the banking through telephone banking, through online or through digital means. So we'll respond to changes in customer behaviour, but we're really committed to the communities in which we serve. That's why we've, in 2023, launched 198 customer pop-ups, and they are effectively colleagues going into the community through libraries, through leisure centres, through community centres to be able to provide those banking services. Okay,
thank you. And Mr. Robertson, is there anything further you would want to add?
I think the question about do we see a final footprint number would be no. I think I would echo what people have said. It's driven by customer behaviour, and I think the key thing for us is we bank the whole of the population in Wales. We bank 1 in 5 business, 1 in 5 households in Wales, and we want to have a proposition that fits the needs for everybody. So that ranges from our contact centres, our Welsh contact centres, it ranges to our mobile van reach that we've got, it ranges to our branches as well. We've got a strategy called Rural Protect, where we want to have 99.9% of the population within 30 minutes drive off a banking touch point. So, and that's our strategy going forward.
Okay, but not a branch. It's within
banking facilities, yeah, within banking facilities.
Okay, but that enabling a face-to-face meeting about banking matters, but not necessarily providing the range of services that a branch would currently
at the moment, we've got 94% of the population covered within 30 minutes of a branch. So that's, and we would look to try, where at all possible, to maintain that. Where that's not applicable or where that's not possible, obviously we would look at other alternatives in conjunction with Link, for example, around banking hubs, etc.
We'll come on to banking hubs in a moment, I think. But Ruth Jones, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much for coming in person today. It's really helpful to see you face to face. Now, you've explained quite carefully the rationale behind the reasons for cutting down on branch numbers. But I'm still not clear. You've talked about footfall. Are the branches that you're closing unprofitable in their own right? They can't make the money that you need? Or is it there's some other reason that you're closing the branches? You know, what's the rationale behind? It seems a bit sporadic to me at the moment, and which branches are closing, which ones are staying open. Maybe Mr. Dean first.
So when we look at closures, first and foremost, any decision to close a branch is something that we don't take lightly. We'll use a number of data points to understand which customers are using the branch, how they're using the branch, which services they're consuming. But 55% footfall reduction since Q1 2020 is a customer trend we've observed. We've also seen the subsequent 280% increase in customers using digital technology for their banking needs, and the aforementioned point of 9 out of 10 customers now use telephone banking, online or through the app. So it's in response to customer behaviour.
I suppose, going to Mr. Ravenhill, even if you've got 55% reduction, you've still got 45% going in and using that place, and an increase in digital apps and everything could be from 1 to 7. You know, your stats can be misleading sometimes. So I'm just wondering, we're talking about real people here, real communities. Mr. Ravenhill, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, so when I look at the network today, only 8% of our customer base solely use the branch network. They're already using those alternative channels. So whether that's the app, whether that's the telephony service. Closing branch is always a very thoughtful process. So we have to collect rich data to make sure we're comfortable and confident that we can provide either access to cash or continued advice. So we'll look at the transaction numbers, we'll look at the demographic of the community, we'll look at customers that have registered vulnerabilities with us or needs of assistance. And then we'll use that data along with the FCA's framework to see whether it is a viable proposition to do. But only once we've understood what's really happened locally. So I've got a team of regional directors that are based out in the field. Apparently that's their job, to oversee the branches. So for example, in Wales, there's 2 of those. We'll spend a specialist team out to the community to assess the community, to look at the alternative provisions, make sure there's access, etc. So even before we think of closing, we go through a lot of detail to make sure we can continue to support. So the phone bank would play an important part, our call centres, the app would play an important part. If we feel that there is still a gap where somebody, not regularly but irregularly, may need to see somebody, we'll look at a community banker. Then that's a colleague that will go on a day that everybody understands where and when, and they can still have that face-to-face conversation if they need. So it's about balancing our banking availability for the customer base.
You made a good point about the pop-ups and things like that. And Mr. Layzell, the pop-ups, I mean, you say everybody knows. How does everybody know in terms of your situation? How does everybody know where the pop-ups are going to be and when and, how regularly and things? Because bear in mind, the people you're talking about here maybe don't access social media, maybe don't use the phone apps and things like that.
Yeah, so before we do a closure, we'll make sure that we write out to all of our regular users of that particular branch. We'll also personally contact every single customer in our vulnerability group as well. So we'll make a phone call out to them just to let them know and talk through what are the alternative services for them. Very similar to the peer group here, 93% of our customer base in Wales are already digitally active and using app, online banking, etc. We have our Welsh telephony services so we can converse in both languages as well for that. And we continue to listen, as well as obviously the local advertising and social media that you would expect as well. So we'll continue to do that. And again, we thank the committee for their support, because I know you've also helped us to encourage and talk about the use of those services. We listen to our customers on a regular basis. So when we do those closures, as well as looking at all of the data points and the local dynamics, we listen to what are the services that they were currently using and what are the services that will be there for them, whether it be through the post office, a banking hub, and or indeed through our amazing colleagues that are there to deliver, helping them to open products with frauds and scams and supporting them with their everyday banking needs.
Okay, thank you. But Mr. Robertson, in spite of all of this, there's still a core of people who want to go into the bank, who can't pay in a cheque. I know cheques are old-fashioned, but some people still use them, and they can't pay them in over their phone. So the hubs, they don't, they're difficult to access for certain people. So how do you overcome this? Because banking should be, an inclusive situation, rather than at the moment where you're looking to almost cut it down and make sure people all move on to the digital way, if you like.
Yeah, no, I agree. Banking should be inclusive. So for us, particularly when we look at customers in more vulnerable situations, prior to making a decision to close a branch, we will review that data very closely. So it's not just about utilisation of branch, how many customers are using. We'll look at our vulnerable customer data. Our approach around vulnerable customers is we will make outreach to them 3 times by phone. If we don't contact them, and this is post sending a letter to them, if we don't contact them, we'll send them a personal letter with a dedicated phone number to one of our customer support specialists, who they can then speak to, that can help them around any alternative ways of banking that are available to them. In addition, we have got a financial foundations programme, which we take out around schools, community groups and local businesses, which is helping educate customers around fraud and scams, but around financial options that are available to them. That's also available in Wales. And in addition to that, we do in excess of 10,000 what we call financial health checks, which is basically reviewing your financial well-being for each customer in Wales every single year. So, and again, they're available in Welsh as well. So we're very keen to make sure that actually we don't leave any customers behind around it. Okay,
thank you. I suppose my final question at the moment is, Nationwide's committed to keeping all its branches open until 2028. So my answer to the 4 of you is, why can't you make a similar commitment? Should we start with you, Mr. Robertson?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So,
Sorry.
It's okay. Obviously, I can't comment on Nationwide's commercial strategy. Our strategy, though, and which I can talk about, is to support the whole of Wales. So whether that be a personal customer, whether that be a business customer. So on the personal side, like our colleagues in the panel, we have seen a huge increase around utilisation of our mobile app. We've got 97% of our journeys completed digitally now. We also have alternatives via, I mentioned the call centre, but we've also got a contact centre for over 60s, which is open 8 till 8, 7 days a week. We've got our mobile van fleet, which services 82 communities. But probably worth touching on the SME support we give as well. So we're proud of our SME proposition in Wales. We provide 1.5 billion worth of lending into that business community. And in addition...
I'll stop you because I know we're going to come on to SMEs in a minute, so don't worry. But Ms. Layzell, I do apologise.
It's okay.
In terms of, Nationwide's made this commitment, why can't you?
And we are committed to investing in Wales. So, for example, in your own constituency today, we're reopening our Newport branch, an investment of £1.5 million. So we'll continue to invest, but we are investing not through the traditional bricks and mortar of a branch, but through banking needs and showing up in the community in a different way. So we're continued and committed to Wales and that investment, but just not in the traditional bricks and mortar way.
And I'm looking forward to going to the opening of against the odds here.
Thank you.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry. That's why I was keeping quiet about that. Mr. Ravenhill, have you anything else to add to that?
No, I think, as I said earlier, I think customer behaviour sits right at the heart of any decision. So I'm not sure putting a date on it is particularly helpful because actually the behaviour of the customer, which is what's really important. And I think when you use the framework that we have today and working with Link, the regulator, it's about making sure that customers feel supported wherever they are. So if it's access to cash, it could be the post office, it could be our branches, or it could be the free-to-use ATMs. If it's advice, it still could be our branches, it still could be our community bankers. But more and more, my customers are telling me they want convenience and they want to be able to do some of that from the comfort of their own home without travelling. So it's about balancing that whole infrastructure for Wales.
Thank you. And Mr. Dean, do you have anything to add?
As my colleague said, can't talk specifically around a competitor, an individual competitor. However, we're committed to Wales. We made a commitment at the start of the year, 2024, that we won't close any more branches that weren't previously announced as we observe the customer trends and customer behaviour. As Carole mentioned, I think banking goes beyond just branches, which is why we're looking at things like cash pods, which will provide deposit and withdrawal capability 24/7 into the communities that we serve. 198 touch points into the community last year, of which we want to do even more. So it really is going beyond just the bricks and mortar of branches and being there and present in Wales and the community.
Thank you. I'll hand you back to the Chair now.
Thanks, Ruth. Ben Lake, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I think each one of you have mentioned the need and the importance of following customer behaviour, addressing business need in the process of making a decision on your branch network. I'll ask to begin with Mr. Dean and Mr. Robertson, given that you both have branches in my constituency for the time being. How important do you think it is to follow the needs of customers in rural areas specifically? And how much, when you're considering the future of your branch network, stock would you place in the rurality, the distances they need to travel between market towns, and therefore the accessibility to any remaining branches you may have for a very large geographic area? So if I could start with Mr. Dean.
We take into account a number of data points when making the difficult decision to close any branch. That will include infrastructure, it'll include location and geographical distance to alternatives, to banking services. We take it incredibly seriously, and if I look at the Postal Services Act and the data point, they've provided 95% of people are within 3 miles of a post office. The post office is just one alternative, but also the cash pods that we're launching to be able to offer deposit and withdrawal capability to our customers, and also being ingrained in the community, being present where our customers want us to be is wholly important. But we also have one of the biggest sectors in Wales for us is agriculture. We have relationship managers and relationship directors out there speaking to farmers in the agricultural community, and partnering with the likes of NFU, the National Farmers Union, to make sure that actually we always have a good read on our customers and we're able to support them where they need it.
Thank you. Mr. Robertson.
Yeah, thanks. So supporting the rural communities is hugely important to us. It's a key part of what we do, similar to some of the assessments that we make around that. We're very proud of our mobile bank fleet, which helps us support rural communities. We cover 82 communities, separate communities across Wales, most of these in rural positions. And we visit 41 of those at least once a week, and another 41 of those at least once every 2 weeks. Stops range from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on demand within that local community. But to a point earlier, our Rural Protect strategy allows us to look at customers that are 30 minutes or more away from a banking touchpoint, and in that case, if they're 30 minutes or more away, we would make the decision not to proceed with any closure. So the rural part is very important. We also support the agricultural sector across Wales as well.
Okay, that's very interesting. Ms Layzell and Mr Ravenhill, sadly you've both decided to close your remaining branches in Ceredigion. I think you've both touched, as have your colleagues, customer behaviour. I'm just interested in terms of the process to decide on closing the branches. What consideration, if any, had been given to Saturday opening, for example? Because I'm told by some of the surveys that I've done in my constituency that a Saturday opening would be very popular because people increasingly during the week aren't able to pop out at lunchtime as they may have done in the past. These behaviours have changed. I'm just interested whether or not any consideration was given to a Saturday opening in some of these branches before the ultimate decision to close them. So if I can start with Mr Ravenhill.
Yeah, certainly, thank you. So, as I said earlier, I think I'm very thoughtful that it can be more difficult for customers in rural areas to visit our branches. So when we do our assessment of closure, as I said, we look at the transactions, the demographics, etc. If the branch wasn't already open on a Saturday, and I'd have to have a look specifically for Cardigan, the likelihood is that it had proved to be quiet previously, and therefore we'd followed customer behaviour to a point. And at some stage, you then make a decision around actually how better to use all of the facilities of the bank to support that area. And that's where, whether that be a community banker maybe going less regularly, but being a physical presence is still really important in terms of that. But I'd have to come back to you on Saturday, Ben.
Okay, thank you. Ms Layzell.
Yeah, so again, very similar. We would look at the footfall for the particular branches, and then when we're looking at our banking services through our touch points, which I know that within your constituency, we would look in terms of what the facilities that we have available, if it's a library or a leisure centre, and then try to map in terms of how can we access the majority of that footfall at any given time. Of course, you've still got the option of doing telephony banking, again in the bilingual, and again we've got our vans. We've got 2 sustainable vans across the whole of Wales, which are reaching places where we've never even had branches before. So we're really getting out there.
But just to be clear then, there were no branches in Ceredigion that were open on Saturday. And actually, Mr Dean and Mr Robertson, I believe also neither of your branches either were open on a Saturday. And they are located in market towns, which are busiest on a Saturday. Some of these town centres and town councils actually have Wi-Fi data to prove that they're busier on a Saturday. But moving very quickly on to the next question, when a branch is closed, clearly there are certain electorates within a constituency that are more dependent on that extra support. We've touched upon, I think a few of you have touched upon the elderly. One of the concerns that I've received from groups in Ceredigion is the way in which the actual digital apps aren't very accessible for those who are visually impaired. So if I can just very quickly ask you, do you know whether your digital banking apps or websites have the voice-over capability or indeed the zoom-in capacity? Because I'm told for those who are visually impaired or blind, those functions are specifically useful and allow them to maintain the digital banking service. If I start this time, Mr Dean, and then we'll work our way down the panel.
Yeah, so I'll need to come back to you with the specifics in terms of, because I think there was 4 different aspects in that question, but overall in terms of how we're supporting the elderly, we've had a huge piece of work in terms of spending time not just trying to support through the digital means, but also spending time coaching, developing. We've given away 2,400 tablets to work with the elderly, which has also meant that there's situations they were unable to do previously that they now can, and it goes beyond banking in terms of that. But I'll come back on the specifics if that's okay.
Thank you. Mr Ravenhill.
So in terms of the app, when it's designed, the designers actually look to make sure it's as inclusive as possible. The 2 things I'd call out in terms of supporting people with vulnerabilities, one would be the zoom-in feature, yes. The second would be actually the app you can actually use signally, so actually convert the pages into British Sign Language to support people as well.
Ms Layzell.
Again, very similar, and I'm happy to come back to the committee with the actual specifics because, like Mr Dean said, there's lots of characteristics there. I think there's some assumptions, though, that maybe we need to dispel, particularly about the elderly. We've published a report back in 2023, and when you think of contactless, for example, for the first time, the population between the 85 and 95-year-olds passed 80% on contactless for the first time, but we'll continue to support our elderly customers, and of course we have the British Sign Language on the online, on our website and app as well, but I'll give you the specifics afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we support British Sign Language as well. I think we've got a full, the range of vulnerabilities is vast. I think the last definition under FCA was 23 separate vulnerabilities. So we look to make all our touch points, including our app, as accessible as possible. So, and we take into account that broad range as well. So I think it'd be fair for me to come back to you in writing just with that whole range that we do support.
Thank you, Chair.
Ben, Ruth, Robin, no, pardon.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, I'm Robin, the MP for Aberconwy in North Wales. We have a problem. We have Dyffryn Conwy Valley, and SMEs are coming to me and explaining that over time what's happened is services have been closed up the valley, and they've been told that counter services, for example, what they need to, they can access those in Llandudno on the coast. And of course, within months, we're then told that the branches in Llandudno are closing and they have to go along the coast to Colwyn Bay. Each one of those can seem rational and sensible, but each one of those is effectively another bus ride. So given the large number of small businesses in Wales, what are you doing to support their face-to-face needs? Start on the left, please.
So in 2023, the first 10 months of 2023, we opened 23,000 SME accounts, of which nearly 60% of them...
Can you give me some personal feel to this? The numbers just sounds a bit robotic and detached. It may be perfectly valid, but can you give me some personal assurance, please?
Yes, so 55% of our SMEs bank with us digitally, and we know, having done a lot of client feedback sessions and trying to ascertain feedback, which we do regularly, one of the greatest things they're looking for is speed, and they want time to spend on their business, which they've spent a long time building. So what we've looked to do is we've looked to introduce a funding mechanism by which we can spend, or we're committed now to spend $70 million, 55 million sterling, on enhancing the digital technology across HSBC, and that's able to support people to make sure that they have more time on their business, they can bank more on their terms. And whenever we look to make a closure, as I said previously, it's a very difficult decision, but in the last round of closures, 99% of customers were within 1 mile of a post office. So we always look at alternatives and work with Link, and if there's a recommendation to put an alternative, we will always make sure that happens.
Answer.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of businesses, depending on their size, obviously, as my peer to the right said, the post office is one of the key ways that they can continue to do it, as well as accessing our branch network. So on a daily basis, they can bank up to £4,995 in terms of cash, in terms of doing regular deposits in and servicing it that way. In addition to that, if we're closing a branch, obviously within the legislation, working with the regulator and Link, we're looking at whether deposit solutions need to be popped in. So whether that's something within the post office itself or whether that's a standalone machine to support. If it's a larger business and we're talking significant, more large sums of cash, actually we'll use one of our 10 relationship managers in Wales to talk closely with that business. They live there, they're based there, and they want to understand how they can best support that business to operate. And often we can do a courier service to collect and drop off cash for them.
Thank you. I did not know that. Ms Layzell.
Yeah, very similar. So like the personal customers, our SME customers are supported wider than just the traditional bricks and mortar of a branch. The feedback on our Barclays local touch points from our SME customers continues to be very, very positive. We've got the post office. I won't repeat what was just being said there, but we also offer something called Barclays Collect, which is where we will go to the SME customers and collect their cash for them. We have over 140 customers across Wales that currently use that service where it's collected, so that saves them the journey to come into a branch or into one of our touch points.
Thank you, Mr Robertson.
Yeah, and just to build, we've got 30 relationship managers across Wales, and we also have a direct cash service called Bank to You, so a courier service that's available. I'd reiterate as well, we've got our mobile van reach as well, which serves 82 communities across Wales, which in some of these are in the more rural areas as well. So
I'll come back to the transportable bank solution, because it's not all quite as it seems, that is it. If I understand your answers correctly, you're indicating that there is a demand for the faster services, there's a demand for different kinds of transactions. How much is that the case, and how much does that balance with actually you're driving that change away from face-to-face and counter-based services? Mr Ravenhill.
I think customer behaviour has naturally been changing before us. I think the last data I saw around cash as a transaction was 2022, and I think then it took about 14% of the total transactions. That same report showed that it was going to continually decline down to maybe 7% by 2032. So we're genuinely following behaviour. I'm sure, like you, when you're out and about now, I typically will use my card and I'll tap it to pay for something. I tend not to carry as much cash as I used to. Cash is still important, and that's why the framework's there to give that access both for customers and businesses. So I think it's their behaviour that we're following.
Mr Dean.
So look, it's really important that we continue to support SMEs. To the point mentioned, the trend is there, so customers and clients do want more time back. However, as the data shows, 49% since 2019. There's been a 49% reduction since 2019 in processing of coins and notes. So that trend is there, but we want to make sure that we support all our customers and clients through that journey, but also to make sure that they do have access, which is why things like the cash pods that we've launched will enable them to deposit and withdraw 24/7, so not just fixed in the fixed normal hours of 9 to 5 that you may see in a branch network. Actually, that'll go beyond that.
Mr Robertson.
Yeah, so I think for me, so cash is declining. There's no doubt about that, but cash is still there. So that's why when we look at our proposition, we will have a proposition that covers the full suite of options available to customers, and that's why we talk about the courier service around Bank to You for SMEs specifically. We've also got Intelligent Safe, which allows you to deposit within your own premises as well. Around that, obviously other access points as well. So we look at the full range of services because we are aware that cash is still there, although it is declining.
Okay, Ms Layzell, is it a similar picture from yourselves? Fine. Can I move to the subject of debanking then? Because it's not just about face-to-face and counter-service, it is about an overall relationship with banks. There has been a lot of concern about debanking. Why do you think that's become more of a concern for SMEs? Start on the left, Mr Dean. Oh, sorry, forgive me, I'll start with Ms Layzell.
Yeah, of course. So obviously we make sure that we're supporting local businesses as being part of the community, but we do have a number of sort of regulatory and legal commitments to make sure that we're adhering to the rules of that law. So I think there are a number of banks who have had to close potentially customers' accounts, and the vast majority of the related to situations may be suspected fraud, financial crime concerns, sanctions, compliance, and or indeed non-use of the account as well. So customers are far more likely to be exited because of the need to operate in compliance with the law rather than and the regulatory obligations within that front. So something we take very, very seriously, but we do have those obligations.
It's interesting you say that because, of course, Barclays closed 79,000 SME accounts in 2023. How can you be sure that those were all fair decisions?
So we did a very, very robust process. We reached out to every single one of those customers between 8 and 12 times. It wasn't just a 1 or 2, 3 times, 8 to 12 times to make sure that we got the regulatory notifications, the know your customer guidelines and legal requirements on there. So yes, in 2023, that was a big programme for us, but we went through a very robust process to make sure that we got to the right outcome for customers and obviously for our legal obligations.
Mr Ravenhill, the Treasury Committee did a report into SME finance, and they highlighted evidence from SMEs, such as pawnbrokers and slot machine manufacturers, who claimed they had been debanked due to the bank's concern over potential reputational risks or due to the low risk appetite of the banks. Some of your customers, SMEs in Wales, being excluded from banking services based on the type of work, the type of business they do?
Not to my knowledge, in terms of that, we would take closing anybody's account incredibly seriously. I wouldn't add much more than my colleague said in terms of the process you follow and the framework. The vast majority of accounts that we close are because they've become dormant. The only other time that I personally would support a closure is if a customer has been violent or abusive to one of my colleagues.
Right, thank you. And Mr Dean, do you recognise that question of risk and risks to the reputation of your bank as a reason or as a consideration for debanking a client?
There's nothing more to add than my colleagues have said. There's a rigorous process. We look at the regulation around legalities connected to it. Nothing more to add.
Mr Robertson, for completeness.
Very consistent around that.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Ruth, did you want to come in on this?
No, it's okay. I'll leave it.
So if I could just very quickly just come on in on this issue about debanking. So I've had a business in my constituency contact me about this, and unfortunately Ms Layzell is in relation to the programme that Barclays carried out. And he described to me how he tried to take the Know Your Customer forms back to a branch. It was recorded that he had attended the branch on the day, but the forms weren't sent then to the correct other part of your organisation, and as a result he found himself cut off from his account, unable to trade. Now you might say, well, that's a bit of an outlier and you don't know the full circumstances, but it does fit a picture that Mr Miller has been describing, where a lot of very small businesses, particularly if they're cash heavy, particularly if they're in rural areas where you don't want to have physical branches anymore, they are a nuisance to you, aren't they? They are not valued customers. These small businesses are effectively a nuisance that you want to get rid of, isn't it?
We're fully committed to the SME market across the UK and in Wales, and yes, I'd like to say that was an outlier. I don't know the specifics of that particular case, but coming back to the point I made earlier to your colleague there, it's not just a once touch and then if the paperwork doesn't turn up then we would do that 8 to 12 times. We will contact that customer, work through them, whether that be telephony, whether that be face to face, whether that be through our relationship managers. We are committed to making sure we get the right outcome for our personal and our SME customers.
Thank you. Ben Lake, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just in terms of, again, looking at customers' needs and trying to cater for them as best as possible, in my part of the world, of course, the Welsh language is a very important factor to consider. In recent months, there have been decisions taken, I think it was by HSBC, to close the Welsh language phone line. I'd be very interested to hear why.
So thank you. So it was an incredibly hard decision to close, obviously, the Welsh-speaking line in Wales for HSBC. Of 607,000 customers we have in Wales, only 1,600 unique customers were using the service. So what we've tried to do is put in a more sustainable model right now, which is it involves utilising the Welsh-speaking language of our colleagues in branches, utilising a callback service. So a customer will call our main line, they'll then put a callback service, and we've seen them operate as quick as 10 minutes. But ultimately, a customer can also, if they want to take longer, they can obviously, we can call them at a time that's more convenient to them. And that the feedback so far has been positive towards that. In Q1 so far, we've had 17 customers who've came out of the main line and used that service. And as I say, the feedback's been positive and utilises the skills of some of the great colleagues we have across the branch network in Wales.
As a HSBC customer myself, actually, I'm interested to know whether there are any plans to offer Welsh language service through the app.
We always review our services. It's always under review. It's certainly something I can take away and have a look at.
I'd very much appreciate it if you would. In terms of the Welsh language line, I know that some of the banks continue to have a fully sort of serviced Welsh telephony line. I think Mr Robertson, you mentioned the centre in Menai, is that correct?
That's correct, yep.
Could you explain just a little bit about the service and why it is that you've come to a different sort of decision than HSBC?
It's an important part of our offering. So we're currently working with the Welsh Language Commissioner's Office. Our Chief Financial Officer, Katie Murray, and our Chief Marketing Officer, Mark Joblin, met with the Deputy Commissioner in March, and we're working towards Welsh language accreditation. I believe we're the only financial institution to be doing that. And as we work with them, they'll help us adhere to the implementation of it and any development around that as well. We're fully committed to the Welsh language. Menai, we have 16 Welsh-speaking colleagues in Menai. They handle 50,000 calls per year, so just under 1,000 a week around that, and they provide what we see as an invaluable service around it. And our financial health check, which I talked about earlier, and our financial foundations are all available within Welsh.
Thank you, that's very, very good to hear. Ms Layzell, do yourselves have a Welsh telephony service?
We do indeed. So we've got 58 colleagues that speak Welsh across the whole of the estate, but we do have that service available Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Ours is slightly different in terms of we don't have them based in one place. There's 17 colleagues that are regular on the phone, but they could be working out of one of our touch points, they could be working from home, they could be in one of our branches.
The service is there?
The service is there. Very similar, we continue to work with the Welsh Language Commissioner to see how we can continue to improve our services to new and existing customers. And our Welsh language speaking colleagues will also have a badge when they're out and about in the community to identify that they are Welsh speaking as well.
And finally, Mr Ravenhill.
Yeah, similar. So colleagues in the branches would display the Waith badge in terms of letting people know that they'd be able to support the customer in Welsh. The actual, our telephony service, actually, we had a Welsh line, but actually we didn't feel it was doing a good enough job. It was a bit sporadic. If somebody was off, it wasn't staffed. We'd had a natural decline in Welsh-speaking colleagues to support it. So by the end of this year, we're reinvesting in that, actually. And so by the end of the year, anybody will be able to ring the main switchboard, doesn't matter from where, asked to speak in Welsh, and we will, working with a specialist supplier, provide a translation service to enable any customer, anytime, to talk to us about anything. Before, it used to be limited to certain transactions and general banking. This will enable us to be far broader and give wider support.
Thank you. Do we have time for one final?
Very quickly then, because time.
Very quickly, you've all mentioned the importance of serving business customers, personal account customers. If I could make a plea, one other sort of type of customer that is very important across Wales for that matter, but specifically in rural areas, are those community account holders or the treasurer account holders. We won't go into detail now because we don't have the time. All I would say is that the branch closures have had a particularly devastating impact on their ability to undertake very basic functions on their accounts, including changing mandates. I've heard from over 120 organisations in Ceredigion alone, all of whom have concerns about just being able to change mandates on their accounts. None of you have mentioned it today. We're not going to be able to actually go into it in further detail, but if I could plea with all of you to look again at the way that you handle and serve community account holders, I'd be very much appreciated.
Just 2 seconds on that. So Ben, I recognise the feedback, and because of that, we've actually changed our online offering. So now, club and society accounts can change their mandate online to save them having to do that. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Very quick follow-up question. Mr Dean, HSBC has never offered a mobile van banking service to its customers. Mr Ravenhill, Lloyds made a decision to end a mobile banking decision. Can you explain why you don't think mobile banking is important? And as briefly as possible, please, because there's a quick follow-up to this.
So when we made the difficult decision to close a branch, we look at an array of different alternatives.
It sounds like a long-winded, just a simple answer. Mobile, I'm not talking about branches, we're talking about mobile banking solutions.
So mobile banking is just one of the solutions. So we look at an array of solutions cash pods, touch points to be able to support the community out in Wales.
Okay, thank you.
So 170 stops nationally, 15 of those in Wales. Over the last 4 years, the frequency of customers visiting them has dropped by 90%. On average, only 14 people were being served at each stop, which had already moved to bi-weekly. So very, very little usage, Robin. When we looked at the stops, all of them had a post office that offered far longer opening hours within 0.3 of a mile, and all of them had free-to-use ATMs. Where we found that the transaction analysis showed that actually some customers were using them more than just for cash, we put a community banker in, so they'll visit exactly the same time period, bi-weekly, in a named place to support customers in the same way.
I'm reassured by that because, Mr Robertson, I know the NatWest service was effectively offline for nearly 5 or 6 months through a combination of the broken vehicle and the sickness of the individual who'd been operating it. So the resilience isn't there always, even when the service is being offered. But my concern is, and it touches on what Mr Legg just said, is that there's knowing the cost of everything and the value of nothing. Wales works on the basis of community. The language isn't just a transactional exchange. The banking service in the communities, the work of the treasurers in those community groups isn't just a transactional thing. There is an important network of community relationships there, and that would be my takeaway to you, is to don't overlook and neglect that, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Final thought from me, and a question really, is around the post offices. All of you have referred at different points this morning to the role of post offices in filling the gap created when you shut branches, and it is true that you see post offices all across our constituencies now playing a bigger role in serving the banking needs of your customers. Are sub-postmasters being fairly incentivised and rewarded by the banks to do this service for your customers? And perhaps Mr Ravenhill, sorry, you've been speaking a lot this morning because you're dead centre, but perhaps you could go first on that.
So I wouldn't be able to comment on the post office financial remuneration of them. What I do think is the banking framework that the banks put in place with the post office to make sure they were there and to serve their customers was of mutual benefit to both. So I wouldn't be able to talk much more about the commerciality of it, though.
Right, okay. Because you are expecting the post offices to plug a gap on behalf of your customers, aren't you?
We do, and we entered into a financial arrangement with them to ask them to do that on our behalf.
Right.
Yeah.
And, okay, unless any of you, the other panellists, have got anything further to add on that question, then I'll bring this part of the session this morning to a close. We're slightly running over time, but a huge thank you to the four of you for being here with us and answering our questions in such a helpful way. So we'll suspend this sitting for 1 minute while we seamlessly transition over to our...
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Okay, good morning. Welcome to this second part of today's session of the Welsh Affairs Committee, looking at future of high street banking in Wales. In the first session, we heard from the four main high street banks. For this second panel, we're joined by by Ross Borkett, who is Banking Director at the Post Office. We're joined by John Howells, Chief Executive Officer at Link, and we're joined by Gareth Oakley, Chief Executive Officer of Cash Access UK. All three of your organisations and businesses are in different ways helping to plug gaps created by closure of the high street branches that we've just been discussing. And perhaps you could just, by way of just setting the scene for this second part of the discussion, just tell us briefly how you're doing that and any particular thoughts you've got in response to what you heard from the banks this morning. And we'll do this in a pretty concise way. So perhaps Mr. Howells, you could go first.
Thank you, Chair. So my name is John Howells. I run Link. Very concisely, Link's job is about making sure the country has a network of free ATMs and recently also a network of shared banking hubs to replace branch closures. We're a not-for-profit organisation, heavily regulated, owned by the banks and ATM operators, so it's an unusual beast, but it is a not-for-profit public interest organisation. I think the key points I'd bring out from the previous half hour or so is cash use is declining. You know, whether it's being driven by dark forces or whether it's just customer behaviour, I'll leave others to decide. But cash is in long-term reduction. It has been for 10 years in this country and most others. I don't see that changing, so I think we're on track in Wales and across the rest of the UK to becoming a very low cash country. That presents a significant problem because we've got in Wales currently about 250,000 people who rely on cash and other forms of non-digital services. It's not just cash, it tends to be other face-to-face banking, other public sector contacts, whether it's something as simple as a letter from your doctor. So we've got 250,000 people in Wales who rely on cash and other non-digital services. It's far too many just to leave to market forces. And as you heard, for all sorts of very good reasons, things like bank branches are going to disappear. I think your comment, Chair, that you're probably going to see only 50 branches in a few years' time in Wales is correct. And they won't all be in 50 places. There'll be 5 in Swansea, but there'll be none in Mumbles at all. There probably aren't any at the moment. So we've got a challenge. Something needs to be done about it. Link's job voluntarily is to recommend if you lose your last branch, do you get a banking hub or some other form of shared services? My colleague Gareth here will talk about how Cash Access UK then goes and sets that up and run it. But we've got a voluntary arrangement at the moment to try and deal with branch closures. Very, very important. Fortunately, it's going on a statutory basis with the FCA now overseeing that, because I think for something as important as this, no matter how willing, commercial organisations or organisations like Link are not the right place to do it. It should be government and the FCA running it.
It's really, really helpful. Thank you. So, Mr. Oakley, perhaps you could follow that, and then we'll ask Ross from the Post Office to come.
Yes, so we're effectively the next part of the process. So, Cash Access UK is a non-profit organisation which is owned by 9 major high street banks. Our job is to put banking hubs and deposit solutions into communities once Link has undertaken an assessment of that community after the last bank in town has closed. In Wales, there have been 10 banking hubs that have been recommended. By the end of June, there will be 5 up and running. Those banking hubs have been extremely well received. Despite the fact that in those communities are smaller by population than the average across the UK, the usage of those banking hubs is significantly higher than the average across the UK. And what we can see is that there are more likely to be more people that are depending on bank services and the use of cash in those communities.
Okay, that's really helpful. And Mr. Borkett from the Post Office, just very briefly, because I know Ruth has got some other questions about the Post Office services that she wants to ask you, but just in terms of your response to what we just heard from the banks.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. So my name is Ross Borkett. I look after banking services at the Post Office. So we have over 900 Post Office locations across Wales, offering banking services as part of our core proposition. Postmasters are offering cash withdrawals and cash deposit services for almost every bank in the country, and offer a change giving and cheque service for businesses and for consumers when it comes to cheques. Our network is much more rural in Wales and the rest of the country. 60% of our post offices operate within a rural community, and the reliance on postmasters to offer cash services has grown and grown. Over the last 3 years, the volume of cash that postmasters are handling has gone up 50%. Both deposits and withdrawals. We now serve over £200 million every month through our Welsh network. So as bank networks have changed, there's much more reliance on local community postmasters and providing cash services.
Thank you very much. Ruth Jones, do you want to follow on?
Yes, and you've already heard the first panel, and I suppose, Mr. Borkett, in terms of the closures of banks, are you seeing, you've already mentioned an increase in transactions and things, so do you see that continuing? Because we were told very clearly in the first panel that, do you know what, cash is disappearing. Now you're just telling us that actually cash is not disappearing.
I agree. I don't think cash is disappearing. I think we can see overall the use of cash is in decline. I don't think that's up for debate, but there is still a huge number of people who are either wholly or partly reliant on cash, and certainly we see that as other alternatives like bank branches consolidate their networks, that the reliance on our network has only gone up, and we see that not just in Wales but across the whole country.
And I suppose my other question is, Newport West is not a problem. We've got lots of things and facilities, and obviously my colleagues are very jealous about Newport West. But in terms of going up the valley, say to Islwyn and Cross Keys and Abercarn, Newbridge, post offices are closing there. So my worry is, will the people who live in those areas, the valleys, either have to travel down to Newport, or they, and for SMEs, for instance, their cash drop-offs and things like that. It's becoming more and more restricted. How is that being managed?
So the way we operate our network is we have a commitment to government to maintain our network size and meet 6 access criteria. So we must have a presence within certain percentages of the population. That is a commitment we've had for a long time and we continue to meet. And so you're right, we do have some closures, and with a network of our size, we've got over 11,500 branches across the country, almost all run under a retail franchise type model. So there will be times a postmaster decides, for example, they may retire, and therefore that post office will close. What we try to do is to reopen, and we have, in fact, across the country this last year, we've opened more branches than have closed. We don't go out and proactively close, we react to those situations. What we look at is, are we still meeting the national access criteria, the commitment we've made? And if we're not, then we need to take action. We will work to do that. I think to build on that, though, that's what we do within sort of our world. The world going forward under the access to cash regulations means that Link will play an important role of assessing not just what's happening around post office cash services, but all cash services in communities, to make sure that that assessment is done, and if needs be an intervention, then is made.
Yeah, okay. I understand what you're saying there about the cash, closing and things like that. But sub-postmasters, we're certainly in my area, in the valleys coming down into Newport, there's a problem. They can't get sub-postmasters. Once somebody retires, it's really difficult to get somebody in. And so the post offices are closing, and that's a big issue for that area. They've lost, the banks have gone, then the post office isn't there. They can't get free cash. I'm sure we'll come on to that in a minute, but, I'm frustrated by this.
No, I understand. And so I guess a few things to try and take you through that. So you're absolutely right. It is challenging sometimes in some communities to find a willing business to take on a post office. There are some communities where actually there are no businesses, so maybe the last community shop closed, it hosted the post office, and it can be very difficult to support that. We do look at where we run our own outreach vans into communities, so in some cases we would offer that type of service. In some cases we can bring in a temporary service while we try to look for a more permanent solution, especially if we're not meeting our access criteria commitment, then we will need to do that to make sure that we do. So it's something we continue to look at. It's something when we look at our proposition we make towards postmasters, we obviously try and make it as attractive as possible, and obviously where we are struggling we try to make it more attractive to try and attract other people to take on that facility.
I may come back to you in future months. Thank you. I'll hand you back to the Chair.
Thank you very much. Robin Miller, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Two groups of questions. Firstly, mostly to Mr. Borkett about the post office, but then I want to develop that into banking hubs. And gentlemen, I'll bring you in there if I may. I think the numbers speak for themselves with regards to post office. There's pretty good coverage across Wales, isn't there?
Correct. So, and in fact, we have a high density of post offices in Wales than we do for the rest of the UK, and in the nature of being a more rural set of communities. So we have a post office for every 3,300 people within Wales versus 5,500 for the rest of the UK.
But we have to go under the skin of those sorts of figures, because the accessibility is the real issue rather than density. And in terms of that, how far do people have to travel in Wales on average to a post office versus the rest of the UK?
I'm afraid I'd have to come back to you with those figures exactly. We do meet our access criteria, as I laid out, which set out a set of geographical requirements. So, for example, we have to have 95% of rural population within 3 miles of a post office, as well as a number of other criteria. We do meet those criteria, but I'd have to come back to you with an exact figure, I'm afraid.
If you could please, I'll be grateful. In terms of that access and that availability, how long does it take to open a replacement branch if one closes?
So there's 3 parts to an opening. The first part is to find a postmaster or applicant to take on and become a postmaster. The time that takes really varies. It depends how quickly we can do that. Once we have identified somebody, we go through a 2-month consultation with the community to understand whether what we are proposing is acceptable, it meets the needs. And you take an example of, okay, we're going to put something into a community, but it's at the top of a hill, and actually that's really not very accessible for the community. So we try and get that feedback during that phase. It then takes about 3 to 4 months to do the opening. So that is physical changes sometimes to the premises, but it's also the training of staff, often hiring new staff and getting ready. So it typically takes 3 to 4 months from that point.
And on that point, I should mention the elephant in the room. Have you seen a reduction in the number of people coming forward as a result of the Horizon scandal?
It's a good question. I don't have that information to hand, I'm afraid, but I can certainly go and ask colleagues.
I'd certainly be interested, I think the committee would be interested to know whether that's been an impact at all on that. In terms of the business model, though, of the post office, what's that based on? Is it number of transactions? Is it size of the transactions? Perhaps you could just give us an indication.
Yeah, of course. So it's both as far as our cash business is concerned. So yes, it's partly based on the volume, but it is also based on value, and in particular if you think about the deposit work that postmasters do, the more money there is to count, the longer that transaction takes, and therefore the amount of remuneration that we pay to postmasters is higher.
Does it include any kind of assessment of the number of people who come into the post office?
Sorry, in what sense?
Well, literally the number of people who might come in to drop into the post office.
Sorry, I'm not following your question.
I think this is exactly the point. I made the point in the last evidence session that there's a lot of the cost of everything, the value of nothing. And there's a lot of focus on transactions. Okay. I was going to ask you a question about how do you track the use of the Welsh language, for example, in post offices. But what I'm concerned as is that all of these numbers are not addressing a deeper issue, which is the place within a community and its cohesion, which places like banking services, post offices, I could talk about pubs and churches and other things, they offer that, and that's really important, and it gets missed from these sorts of conversations. So that's why I ask about the business model. Is it purely transactional, or is there something more to it? And do you recognise that in my description?
I understand what you're saying, yeah. So when we look at how we partner with postmasters in supporting our communities, there are different models of post office, and you're right, we have a commercial model, should we say, that around banking and our other services, which is predominantly around transaction based, but we also have for some of our communities very low volume communities, but they have add enormous value to that community, and we have community branches where we will fund a direct payment backed by taxpayer subsidy that give to the post office to keep those types of branches open, because we recognise that they are providing an enormous amount of social value. So there will be some communities where it is not a profitable enterprise to operate that post office, but we recognise that what the postmaster and their staff are doing for that community is absolutely central.
That's very interesting, thank you. I wasn't aware of that, but I'm encouraged by that. If I could turn to the question of banking hubs, perhaps let's start with you again, Mr. Borkett. What do banking hubs offer that is not currently offered by post office branches?
If you think of a banking hub in 2 parts, there is the counter where you can transact in for cash. Those services are the same as what are offered in the post office. It is the same counter service, and then there is the community banking element of it, which I'm sure Mr. Oakley can talk more about, which we obviously don't offer in a post office with the banking reps coming in.
Mr. Oakley, can hubs offer all the services that bank branches offer?
They offer the majority of services that you can get in a bank branch. Now, as we've already said, the vast majority of financial transactions are undertaken by the post office. That is almost 100% of what you could do in a bank branch. It's not absolutely everything. The other part of the offering is that community bankers are represented by each of the firms in the local area, and the service that they offer is dependent on the strategy of the individual banks, so they will vary slightly. Having said that, all of the banks which are members of Cash Access UK have reached an agreement with HMT to rationalise those services and be a lot more transparent and clearer about what services will be available, and where some banks are yet to offer some of the services, they're working on that between now and the end of the year, so that there's more consistency across the group.
Mr. Howells, thank you for your patience. How is Link working with the Post Office and Cash Access in the creation and delivery of and operation of banking hubs?
I think it's a very good question. So the legislation only applies to cash. So it does nothing to do with face-to-face services, even though banking hubs, to the credit of the banks, voluntarily offer banking services at the moment. I think there's an interesting question about whether the legislation is strong enough, given that it only applies to cash, because over a 5-year period, things can change, and today's banking hub could become an automated machine in a garage and a chair at the back of a library. So I just flag that as an interesting question, which the FCA has been very clear is not in their scope at the moment. So I think making sure that banking hubs, if that's the thing which communities want, actually end up getting delivered in the long run is a very important question which Link wants to raise and make sure that that's clearly on your agenda. I think that if I look at banking hubs today as they're being rolled out, they're universally popular. And though you can always argue about how many and which towns, if we're going into a world in Wales where we're going from 200 commercial bank branches to 50, and they're going to be concentrated in the major towns, where Cardiff, Swansea, etc., I think we probably could have a reasonably satisfactory position if we supplemented those 50 branches with, say, another 50 banking hubs over the course of the next 5 years. There's always going to be questions about particularly difficult rural areas, are they satisfactory? But I'd say that 50 commercial branches, 50 banking hubs, 900 post offices, very, very important to make sure that they stay there, and a large network of free ATMs, I think I could make a pretty good argument that that will give satisfactory access to cash for Welsh consumers and companies operating in Wales, always accepting that at the margin there could be difficulties, and the FCA will be looking after that.
Thank you. And I would just urge you to remember that Wales is not a homogeneous country, and that North Wales is very different from Mid Wales, very different from South Wales, so some of those ratios need refining, at least at a regional level. Mr. Oakley, are banking hubs taking too long to open? And what could be done to speed up that rollout?
The time that it takes to open a banking hub, from the time that we're advised, the time that it opened, isn't that dissimilar from the time it would take in a residential transaction from identifying a property to, particularly if you had to refurbish it and start from scratch. I think there are two important points though. One which will offer you some reassurance, and another one which will hopefully give you a bit of context. So the first one is under the legislation and the regulation that will come in sometime towards the end of the year. A bank can't close its branch until a banking hub is available and ready. And in July last year, we reached an agreement with the banks to say that that they would stay open for 12 months on a voluntary basis, and that we would guarantee that we had something in place to enable them to leave. Nonetheless, as we approach the end of the year, the legislation insists on it. It's actually law. So that hopefully provides some reassurance. In terms of context, in terms of the speed, one of the things which is very different from the process that we undertake to, let's say, a major coffee chain or a bakery, is that we get advised that a banking hub is required by Link at the same time the general public do. So it is effectively coincidence if there is a property that is available for us to move into at that point. So a lot of the time is spent searching for a property, remembering that we need to be specifically in that high street. If you were to compare that to a major coffee chain, they will be surveying maybe 500 or 600 communities, and they will select them as the properties become available. And so there can be anything from 2 weeks to 6 to 8 months of actually trying to find the right property.
What you're describing is quite a competitive environment for that high street presence. Is that correct?
That's right. So if you think about the general strategy of a retailer, they will be monitoring their preferred community all the time. It may be that their agents are already speaking to landlords, and as soon as a property becomes available, if it's one that suits them, they will be in. Whereas we get advised, and then we walk into the high street and say, okay, what's available? So
2 final questions. First of all, what could be done to improve your competitiveness in terms of accessing those? And secondly, to Mr. Howells, what could be done to improve the operation of banking hubs?
The reason that the process is as it is due to competition law. So when the banks took competition advice, it was deemed that this process had to effectively be done confidentially, and that the commercial decisions of one bank couldn't affect a decision of another. So that is very, very difficult to change. However, there are things that we can do, and we continue to learn and iterate our processes. So we are finding ways to go faster, and we will also find ways to bring in alternatives. So we're quite well progressed, as an example, in conversations with supermarkets about in-store franchises and different types of options that will enable us to have more choice effectively.
Howells?
I think the legislation will bring 2 very strong improvements straight away, which will be you can't close your branch till the banking hub or whatever the agreed facility is open. A clear and simple rule which you can explain to any community and which makes good sense. I think the legislation also gives excellent powers to deliver access to cash. As I said, I think there is a question mark about whether it goes far enough on other banking services. I believe you asked a question earlier about it. Things like advice if you're concerned about fraud, or if you've got a probate issue, or if you just want to go. Those are all things which are, to the bank's credit, being delivered on a voluntary basis through banking hubs. I'm not sure whether that's satisfactory, so I wonder whether there should be stronger control over making sure you have face-to-face banking in communities and not just access to cash, important though that is. And if I play it forward just a few more years, if I may, because like it or not, cash usage in Wales is dropping fast, and that availability is going to be a problem for consumers in, say, 5 years' time. I actually think we should do something to improve digital inclusion. I think it's a missing piece of the national strategy. And I actually think that these banking hubs, which Gareth's organisation are opening up in every major high street in Wales, could be very useful vehicles for helping with digital inclusion. Because in 5 years' time, cash, whether we like it or not, is going to be a very low part of most people's day-to-day transactions at every level of society. And I think we should be thinking now about how we deal with that. The banking hubs could be improved to deal with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If I could just jump in with a couple of supplementary questions here, following on from your remarks there, Mr. Oakley. Would you agree with kind of the history of legislation and regulation around this is always that it's playing catch-up and essentially allowing the horse to bolt before something is done to try to shut the door?
Is that addressed to...
Yes,
beg your pardon.
Oh, sorry, beg your pardon, sorry. Yes, yourself.
I actually think the access to cash legislation is an excellent example of legislation in the nick of time which had cross-party support. So I think all credit to everybody involved, because the network of branches is disappearing before our eyes, but we've actually got a mechanism and some legislation to deal with it.
Nevertheless, vulnerable and not necessarily future-proofed, given what
that is my concern.
Okay.
I think it lacks teeth. It lacks any control over face-to-face banking services, which I think is an issue. I think it lacks digital inclusion, which I think will become an issue very, very rapidly in the lifetime of the next government. And I also, for what it's worth, think the focus on large clearing banks feels a little bit dated. There are other large companies, including the large tech companies, which have a responsibility here. And rather than trying to get the same 5 large banks, who I think struggle sometimes with their own profitability to be paying for all of this, I'd like to see a future government looking at digital inclusion and how do we involve some of the big tech companies in supporting every consumer in the UK, not just the 85% who are already very comfortable using digital.
That's really helpful, thank you. Mr. Borkett from the Post Office. Last week I popped into the Post Office in the town of Pembroke. And it's quite remarkable. It's an old post office building, but you go in and it feels very much like a children's toy and clothing shop, and it's called EduToy. And depending on where you stand in that building, it either feels very much like a toy shop, educational toy shop, or a post office, because they coexist together. And it's an excellent example of how 2 quite different businesses are supporting each other essentially under the same roof. I would encourage you to go and visit them. And they told me that they're now doing transactions for 26 different banks. I mean, doesn't it feel to you a bit frustrating, all the discussion about banking hubs? I mean, you guys are already doing it, aren't they? I mean, why isn't, a number of key post office counters being identified as preeminent locations for doing banking transactions, and they become the banking hubs?
I think you're right. We sometimes get postmasters saying it's one of our best kept secrets that you can do so much cash and banking within a post office. I think it's something we continue to try to raise awareness on, and I would ask everyone who's watching this, go and support your local post office. Use it for cash services. We are supporting cash access in the development and running of banking hubs. We are exploring some models where we are co-locating post offices and banking hubs. It makes a lot of sense to me that a local postmaster is often already the centre of that community. It is already providing cash services. Well, let's bring the banking needs and the cash needs together under a single place. I think one of the benefits one of many benefits we're seeing with the new regulations come in is it is driving the industry to innovate and to think about some different ways of doing things. And my view is we have a great platform through local post offices to build on, and the more we do that, the more we invest in that local post office to do more and more, I think the better for that community. It becomes a more sustainable solution. So I agree. I think there are many opportunities to build on that. It's something that Mr. Oakley and I talk about, and I talk about with the banks, about how we continue to strengthen that partnership.
Is there somebody kind of leading that discussion and doing some kind of scanning of where gaps are emerging and saying, right, that would be a great place for post office and a banking hub to be co-located? Or is all of this being left to local personalities, local activism to basically work out, in which case you are going to have a kind of a very varied spread of these facilities?
I think there's a little bit of both. So I would say as 3 organisations here, we are working closer and closer together. And as the voluntary processes that have been set up through Link become mandatory processes this year under the regulation, I think that will provide a good process for that assessment, and then onwards from that, assessing what the best solution is for that community. But you're right, there is a local element to this. Some of our post offices, absolutely, you could do something together. Some of them are quite small. Some of them might not have that opportunity, and we have to recognise that there will be some communities where we could do something. There'll be some we may not be able to.
Thank you. Mr. Oakley, is there anything further you'd add to that point?
So I agree with an awful lot of that. I mean, as I've said, we effectively have to react to the closure. We're unable to get ahead of the process, if you like. Having said that, we can see that we need to be increasingly more creative in terms of, as I've already pointed out, moving as quickly as we possibly can. I think the only thing that I would just add additional context is that when the original research was done around what's the best model, is particularly for SMEs, they want to be able to undertake their transactions in a sort of secure and confidential environment, and sometimes some of the post offices are very small and not able to do that. And then also the community banker aspect, the ability to get face-to-face advice, is also considered to be an important aspect. Having said that, as Ross has already said, we need to be creative in terms of delivering the right solution for the community.
Thank you, that's helpful. Ben Lake, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming in today. Mr Howells, I fully agree with you that we need to keep an eye on the accessibility of banking services, face-to-face banking services, as well as access to cash. But just turning to the banking hubs and some of the criteria by which an area might be considered for the establishment of a banking hub, am I correct in thinking that there is a certain level of population that you might want to see before considering locating a banking hub in a particular area?
Correct. So the current criteria, which are industry set, broadly, there's a big complicated formula, but broadly it's 7,000 people, 70 shops. So that will pick up large and medium-sized conurbations. It won't pick up smaller ones. I think there are opportunities to improve that, to consider rural clusters as a particular, not just Wales, but that would be an example, so that it's not just a threshold, but actually looks at a patch. I also think there's a fairly well publicised in the press problem with retail-only branches. Nationwide is often picked up, but there's also Halifax and Santander, where if one of those branches remains in a town which would otherwise qualify, they don't get any help, and that's great if you're a retail consumer. But if you're a small business, those organisations don't do small business banking. So I am hoping that the FCA, when they publish their rules within weeks, will have proposals which will deal with places with lots of shops and that they need a banking hub, and rural clusters, because places like North Wales, Central Wales, but Norfolk, some parts of it, that clustering is important to look at, and they're missing out at the moment, and I think there's a case for it. But that's the reason for moving it from a voluntary industry set thing by 10 banks to a FCA controlled, let's make sure we're looking at it for the needs of the community properly.
Thank you, and I think the point is very well made there. You know, there are market towns in my own constituency which will easily surpass the sort of retail criteria in terms of having enough businesses and shops, but then might struggle in terms of the population purely due to the fact that they are market towns, so serve that larger cluster, as you so eloquently put out. So it would be very welcome, I think, for the FCA if they are able to.
I agree. Very much. I think there was an example over here, I think, about North Wales with Llandudno, and each one it closes and it goes another 10 miles down the coast. Now, I think Llandudno, I know it is big enough, it should always have a banking hub. It's far too... So if all the branches close there, that should be the last one which closes, because you've got a long stretch of rural communities which are not going to get a banking hub, and I'm sure it's the same in your community as well.
Just very, very briefly, in terms of the point you made there about when you might have a town or a settlement with just the one bank left, and that might be then preventing further consideration of other alternatives. Is that something that the FCA could also now look again, changing?
Well, I know they've been suggested to look at it. We ourselves, as written in, we don't think it's acceptable to have a community with a large number of retailers not having a banking hub just because you happen to have got a retail branch there. Now, that needs changing, and someone needs to set the number. Is it 50 shops? Is it 100 shops or whatever? Yeah. That's an easy thing to do, and I'm hopeful that that'll be what we get out of the new rules set by the FCA within the next few weeks.
Thank you very much. And finally, from me, if you wouldn't mind just setting out the way in which you approach the different alternative solutions, whether that's a free-to-use ATM, cash deposit facility, and then also a banking hub. How do you decide between those sort of solutions when considering a particular community?
We're given a menu of solutions by Cash Access UK. So I've got a banking hub, I've got a deposit service, which can feature as a spruced up post office or a standalone facility, or I've got a free ATM. And then we've got individual criteria which will say if you drop below 7,070 shops, you move from a banking hub to that's going to be post offices, deposit services and free ATMs. We set those rules at the moment, those boundaries. It's going to be by regulation. That all, I think, I'd argue is good, with my caveat again, it only applies to cash. So it's great it's voluntary for the face-to-face banking services, but I think if there's a problem in a couple of years' time, because it all gets too expensive, it's not good enough, in my view, just to have access to cash in the community. You need that face-to-face basic banking. I think it's a whole.
Mr. Howells.
Thank you very much. Ruth Jones, please.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. Mr. Howell, I know you've mentioned about, it's not just cash, but I'm going back to cash now and free ATMs, because at the moment, certainly in the Valley communities coming into Newport West, for instance, there is an issue with the lack of free ATMs. So there's lots of convenience stores with machines in them, and then you go, oh, it's going to cost you £1.75 or £2 or whatever. And as you rightly say, the amount of cash that's being taken out is small, so therefore the percentage that's being paid is that much more now. So I'm just thinking, in terms of those places, how quickly can you get the ATM? I mean, you've mentioned the ATM, because how quickly can you get them in? Because these communities are really struggling.
Shouldn't be the case. So if you've got a community which has not got free cash access through an ATM or a post office counter, then it should have, and Link's existing policies will deal with that. So we define a high street as 5 shops, so it's pretty small. Yeah. If you've got a community which has got 5 shops and it's got a pay-to-use ATM and there's nothing else within a kilometre, we will pay to get that fixed. So you should just come to me directly and we will deal with that. We can argue about banking hubs and deposit services, but my view is that free ATMs are the last bastion, and you should not have even a very, very small community which has a pay-to-use only.
Like a surgery today, it's marvellous. I should be coming back to you as well. Thank you very much. Just one final question from me. In terms of the ATMs, the Welsh language, there are a number that provide Welsh language, and in fact I tend to use, not that I'm a Welsh speaker, but I use it just to try and keep it going, if you like, in Newport. But how many have Welsh language facilities in Wales, and if one is, say, broken, how quickly does it get fixed?
We don't run the ATMs. That's
Okay.
up to the 10 odd operators out there. I spoke to them, actually phoned up the 2 biggest yesterday just to confirm what their approach to Welsh language is. And as expected, they've said it's up to the location, so they provide Welsh language facilities on ATMs. So if the shop or the library or the school says we want that feature on there, they'll get it. If they say they don't, then they don't. That's up to them, and that changes. There's 2,000 ATMs, so they go up and down. But it is available if the location with the ATM wants it.
Thank you. And in terms of getting things fixed when they're broken?
That should not happen. So we've got within our rules for ATMs, they've got to be running 97% of the time. It's helped by the fact that if it's not working, the operator doesn't get paid. So they've got a very strong incentive to make sure they're up and running. And though there are occasionally problems, I know there was one in the press a couple of days ago in Wales, they touch wood, are one-off, not very often, and we are all over that. So if you have a problem, or you hear of somebody who's got a problem with an ATM not operating, come to us, we can get that fixed straight away. But I would hope that they are very, very rare, and due to some particular problem, like the shop got raided, or the machine has broken or something like that.
Oh, thank you, that's very helpful. I'll hand you back to the Chair.
Thank you very much. Unless there are any final questions from colleagues, just remains to say thank you to you all. I mean, it's been an incredibly informative and helpful session, so thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this morning, and it helps us for our next 2 evidence sessions that we hold looking at the future of high street banking. So I'm sure we'll be in touch with you all again, but we'll bring this session to a close for now. Order. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.